Hey, podcast listeners, Ria Wong with you once again with Nonprofit Lowdown. Today is a fan favorite, my friend Cindy Wagman, founder of Cindy Wagman Consulting. And today we are talking about fractional fundraisers. What is that? We don't know. We're going to find out. Cindy, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
It is just so delightful. Actually, don't know if you know this. The episode that we did with you, me, Jess, and Brooke in the car is one of the top fan faves of 2023.
Amazing. I mean, that was so much fun to record.
Yeah,
So
the
no
second
wonder.
time because I screwed up recording the first time. Oops, my
Oh
bad.
my God, I wiped that part from my memory
Oh,
until you
sorry.
reminded me. It's all
Listen,
good. Yeah,
sometimes things, don't go exactly as planned and we just roll with it.
exactly.
All right, Miss Wagman, before we get into the details of a fractional fundraiser, for folks who are not familiar with you, tell us a little bit about yourself and your nonprofit career. And you are the rare person, I must say, on this podcast who said, I actually set out to be a development person.
Oh yeah. So, okay, I'll take you way back. So I was in university, in my undergrad. I did not like school very much. My favorite part of school were the extracurriculars. I ran the Women's Empowerment Committee. We hosted fundraising events for local women's shelters. Actually, one of those events was the Vagina Monologues, which I produced like 5 times. So, um, that was me. That was little like me in university. And I didn't know that fundraising was a career until one summer I met two people who were professional fundraisers. And I was like, oh, okay. So I wrote a thesis on feminist fundraising, and the rest, as they say, is history. I've been a fundraiser my whole career since then, like right out of university. And then over the past couple of years, I started consulting about 8.5, almost 9 years ago, still doing fundraising. But over time, I realized that there was another gap in the market that I wanted to fill, which was helping other nonprofit consultants build their business. Because we see this in organizations where you take like practitioners and you promote them into manager or different leadership positions, and we don't train them on how to be a leader. Well, the same thing, you take a lot of like practitioners, whether they're fundraisers or strategy or, program evaluation, all these people do the work, but then when they become consultants, no one's teaching them how to run their business. So that's what I do.
Oh, Cindy, you've said a mouthful. You and I and Jess and Brooke and Tanya and Rachel are in a little mastermind where we talk about our business, which is so fun. But I think it's a rarity among nonprofit consultants. Like you
Yeah.
probably get a million calls a week being like, hey, can I pick your brain? Like, why aren't people
Yeah.
out here teaching people how to run a business? Okay, let's talk about fundraisers in particular. So, what I noticed, and look, I had this problem too when I was in ED, is trying to find a development director is like a needle in a freaking haystack.
Hmm.
Everyone is looking for one. Nobody can find a good one. And if you do find a good one, you probably can't afford them and or they leave after 18 months. So let's talk about the pain point first of all.
Okay, so this is a big pain point, and this is something that for me has informed, like my experience with this has informed so much of what I've done in my business. So I have seen so many small organizations, specifically small ones, because that's where my heart is, but they will like squirrel away their money to afford a fundraiser. Usually it's like a fundraising manager or something like that, even coordinator. Um, and they have some budget, but it's not a lot. And what happens is, if they're lucky enough to find someone, they find someone who doesn't have a whole lot of experience because that's just what their budget's aligned with. And when they hire someone in a small organization where the executive director really doesn't know much about fundraising, the board really doesn't know much about fundraising, and you hire someone who is early in their career where they really don't know much about fundraising, that person is set up to fail. And what happens, what I've seen over and over again, 6, 8, maybe 12 months later, that person leaves or is let go because they're not getting the results. And in the meantime, in trying to get the results, they spend a lot of time doing busy work that's not moving the needle, work that's not effective, chasing trends that are not relevant, listening to all the people tell them you have to write a letter to Oprah or Mackenzie Scott or, what have you. And so it kind of just is this, nothing happens. And then the organization's like, oh, well, we let this person go, or they left. Maybe we're not right for a fundraiser. Maybe we shouldn't prioritize this or invest in it. Maybe like they just get really gun shy. And so they don't fundraise for like 6, 12, 18 months. And then they're like, oh, we really need to do this again. So all of this like takes 2 years where they're not raising money and wasting any money that they have invested.
Okay, wait.
And that is a problem.
I'm like feeling this problem so deep in my soul right now, particularly for a cash-strapped nonprofit, because to be honest, you don't want people learning on your dime, which is essentially what you're doing when you're hiring these early career folks. Not
Yeah.
not that there's anything wrong with early career folks, but they're learning as they're going.
Mhm.
And so many things here. So one thing I've been thinking about is we use the term fundraiser or we use the term development professional, but the truth is that can mean a lot of very different things,
Mhm.
right? And I think let's start there because I think especially if you're an ED who doesn't really know much about fundraising and the board doesn't know much about fundraising, it's almost like you're going to the doctor, but you don't actually know which doctor you should be going to. Like
Mhm.
some fundraisers are really good at grants, some are really good at individuals, some are really good at communications. So how do I know as maybe an ED who doesn't know much about fundraising what I actually need?
To know that you don't know, I think is the first thing. I mean, the reality for small organizations is you kind of need a generalist because there's some grant writing, there's some annual giving, there's some major gifts. Hopefully there's no events, but sometimes there is, no big events. So the reality is you actually need a little bit of everything if you're a small organization. And you need someone who can evaluate where to focus the time. And that's the problem. You need to recognize that you don't know and that your board doesn't know. I can't tell you, first of all, when I introduce myself as a fundraiser, people will say, oh, so you host events or like you run events. No, I do not. That is not the best way to fundraise for most organizations. Or people say, oh, so you do corporate, right? Like and boards are like, I don't know why, actually I do know why, but they're so focused on corporate because for them it feels a little less risky in terms of their personal relationships. And people think companies have all this money and we don't want to ask people because we don't want to make them uncomfortable or they don't have as much. So all of these, first of all, acknowledging that you don't know, right? If you're on a board and you have an RFP for a fundraising consultant, or if you're hiring for a fundraising staff person, acknowledge that you need someone who can come in and do the strategy as well and get your hands out of there. Or even better, learn to take direction from the people you do hire, because chances are they're still going to do it better, even if they're early in their career. I mean, I was like this when I first started fundraising. I would go to a conference, like get really inspired. This was back in the day when like printed direct mail was it. We didn't have email campaigns, okay? And I was hearing from like world leaders how best practices are 4-page letters, storytelling, all this stuff. Include the PS. That's the most important part. That's what people read. Okay. So I'd write these great fundraising story-based letters with a PS, and I'd take it to the chair of the fundraising committee, who'd take a red pen and cross it all out. She's like, it can only be a page and a half. Let's drop the PS, drop the stories. People want stats. I was like, no, but this is what happens. And we burn people out this way, or they feel like they're not successful because we're not supporting them and trusting, like, even if they are learning on our dime, we got to trust what they're learning. So I mean, I could rant for a very long time on a soapbox about this, but the bottom line is, especially in small organizations, the vast majority of the time, the best thing the executive director and board can do is trust who they hire to give them direction and recognize that if you're hiring someone junior, they're going to be learning and they might
Yeah.
not know all the things.
As you were talking, I was just thinking of very many instances I can think of where people try to write fundraising letters by committee and it
Oh
never works.
no.
Or you have folks like who are on the board who don't actually understand fundraising, have never done fundraising, but because they have a corporate job, think that they know fundraising. And it
Yeah.
makes me a little bit crazy. Like I would never walk into
No.
your company to tell you how to do your job. Why are you in my
Yeah.
company trying to tell me how to do mine?
And there's like so much evidence in our sector around what works, and they just don't have access to that information. And to be honest, I have seen people with fundraisers, even fractional fundraisers, where they're like, give me the stats. I wanted the evidence. Tell me why that's better. Just stop. Just trust the people you hire. And if you can't trust them, they're the wrong hire. But you gotta let them, at the end of the day, the margin of error is probably very low, right? If they send out one extra email and you're like, oh, we can't send an extra email, people are going to complain. Like, come on,
Yeah.
you're fine. Trust the people you bring on
Yeah.
board.
Okay, so I was thinking about you in this conversation because earlier, I think it was last week, I was on a phone call with a bunch of executive directors, and one of them was talking about, what was she? Oh, she was talking about someone that wanted a promotion but wasn't quite ready for development, but was threatening to leave if they didn't get the promote, like all of the things. And so this ED was kind of like bending over backwards to try to accommodate, even though this person didn't have the skills, didn't have the experience, but was kind of in a place of, I need someone to be in this seat right now. So I could think I mean, so many questions, but you and I talk a lot about this concept of 10x is easier than 2x.
Mm,
And we talk about who, not how. And I think as EDs, we spend so much time thinking about the how and not enough about the who should be figuring out the how. So
exactly.
talk to me a little bit about fractional fundraisers and why that might be a really good answer to the who.
Exactly. So for so many people, it's not just about filling, especially with certain roles, any role in an organization, it's not just about filling the seat. And I do want to preface this by saying, like, you might find someone who's not super experienced, who, like, I was that person. I just stepped into the role and I learned and I did great. But that's not the majority of how people work right now. And that's just not the majority of most organizations' experiences. So the question is, yeah, who, and really it's like, okay, what are the constraints? We have this much budget. We need someone who can bring strategy and implementation, and we need them to be a generalist, to be able to do all the little things. And that's really hard to find traditionally when you look at staffing models. What a fractional executive, and in particular a fractional fundraiser, does is combine all of those, right? So what it is basically you are contracting, or you're hiring as a consultant a fundraiser who typically, if you come to me with my fractional fundraising network, these are all highly experienced fundraisers. They've been working in the sector as fundraisers, usually 10 plus years. Um, they know what they're doing. Okay, so they have that experience. In fact, they have so much experience that you couldn't afford them full time. But because they have all that experience, they're super efficient and strategic and focused. And so what they're going to come in and do is they're going to come in, they're going to create a fundraising plan for your organization. Even if you've done a fundraising plan in the past, even if that was fairly recently, I can tell you it's still worthwhile for them to come in, create a fundraising plan, and then they will implement the plan. So it's kind of like a staff person, but you're paying a fraction of what this person's fees are for a fraction of their time. Typically, the fractional fundraisers I work with have, I would say, like a full-time workload is about 3 clients. Now, doesn't mean you're 100% getting like a third of their time. It means some weeks you're getting no time and some weeks you're getting 90% of the time. But as a whole, it washes out. So you're getting a fraction of their time for a fraction of the cost, and their expertise and efficiency to bridge or combine the strategy and the implementation.
That sounds brilliant, and I wish that I had known about this when I was an ED. But let me push back for a second because I can hear all
Mhm.
of the EDs out here being like,
Mhm.
what's the catch? So what if I come to you and I say, Cindy, I only have budget for what would be a full-time development manager position. I could use that budget instead for a fractional fundraiser that has a lot more experience and expertise. What what's the upside and what's the downside for me? Because I
Mhm.
think the other thing is there could be this idea that like, well, someone really has to be on the team to be able to talk about the work in a way that is
Mhm.
going to be compelling enough for donors.
So the skill to be able to talk about the work in a way that is compelling is not tied to being a staff or not. That is a skill that people have or they don't have. You definitely want to find the people who have that. And absolutely experience helps with that. Um, so the upsides and the downsides. The upside, what I'll say is a fractional fundraiser is really well positioned to help an organization through a period of transition or growth. So if your organization is, you've gone through that, you want to stabilize your fundraising, you're feeling like, okay, we have a track record, things are smooth, we want to see incremental growth, but we're not rocking the boat. Like things are good and we want them better, or our organization is big enough that we want in-house, then great. I would say once you get more than one fundraising staff person on team, you're probably going to want to start building a proper fundraising team, right? And that requires more in-house. But if you are like, we have no one fundraising, we need that first fundraiser, that's where a fractional really bridges that gap or helps that organization. I mean, the downside is I'm trying to think of a downside. Um, I think really the challenges that we see with organizations is where they don't trust, where they're kind of like try to micromanage that person. That's not what a fractional fundraiser is there for. You need to trust their experience and expertise and their strategic oversight. If you don't do that, then it becomes not a great experience. But if you can trust and let them run with things and let them push through with the work, there's only upside.
So if I'm sitting here listening to you and thinking that maybe a fractional fundraiser might be a good option for me, what are the considerations, or maybe I should say readiness? Because I'm just also
Mm,
thinking about small organizations who are like,
yes.
hey, we don't even have a database. Like
Yeah.
or we haven't kept track of our records well, or, our board doesn't fundraise, or we have no track record of individual donations. Like, who would
Mhm.
be a good candidate for a fractional fundraiser? Because I'm also thinking about the fact that if you're working with a very experienced high level person, they're probably not going to be content like data entering and mail
Right.
merging for you.
Right. I mean, some of them do. I call it from strategy to stuffing envelopes because that's sometimes what happens. And that's okay. That's part of the package. I would say if you're not raising anything, it's a big investment. The way I talk, because everyone also wants to know about ROI, right? That's everyone's question when it comes to fundraising. When you look at fundraising growth, it is typically looking at percentage growth year over year. How much more did we raise this year than last year? A healthy organization, I mean, the numbers change right now. They're not actually raising that much more every year, right? Maybe I'd say like good is 10% more, exceptional is probably 20% more, unless you're seriously investing in fundraising growth, like adding new staff or new programs and stuff like that. Small organizations, It's usually less. Usually they're pretty flat year over year. If you want someone to come in, you might like super successful organizations, you're getting, yeah, maybe 20% growth. 20% on 10,000 is very different than 20% on 100,000, which is very different than 20% on 1 million. And so your starting point makes a difference in your results. You're not going to go from not raising any money or raising like $3,000 to overnight raising $300,000. That's not going to happen. It has happened once or twice, but mostly through grants, and it's not sustainable. So if you're not raising anything, you have to have a willingness to invest. Most of the fractional fundraisers that I train and work with, they charge between $4,000 and $5,000 a month on 12-month contracts. So that's 48,000-ish a year, okay? You have to be willing to look at the first year as an investment. If you're raising $2,000, $3,000, it's a big stretch to get to 50, 60,000. Aside from that, like the other sort of readiness things, databases are nice to have, but if you don't have one, expect that part of the fundraising plan that this person will be creating and implementing will be around the back office. It will be setting up the database, migrating some of the data. If it's a lot of data and it's really messy or unclean data, then they might suggest you hire a data expert. But if it's simple and it's easy for them to set up, that's reasonably within work or within scope. That's one area, but really I think it's this idea of like, you have some track record, you have some information, and you need to mature your program.
So one question I have is, you and I have both consulted, and I think sometimes there's some unrealistic expectations
Mhm.
around like, oh, I've hired a consultant and now magic will happen and overnight money will fall from the sky. So if I'm an AD thinking about this as an option for me, what are some ambitious but realistic KPIs that I should be thinking
Mhm.
about in order to track whether or not this is a successful hire?
Yeah. So the how I've structured the fractional fundraisers that I work with is to address some of this and address some of the structural challenges that fundraisers have. So the first thing is we work on 12-month contracts. It takes that long to start to see a return. If you want 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, it's too soon. You're wasting your money. So go all in for the 12 months. That's the first thing. So it requires some patience. It's not a KPI, but it's just like structurally looking at when you can even start to look at the KPIs, right? So you need 12 months at least, which is why I like to talk about the first 12 months as an investment. Any startup with fundraising is an investment because it takes time. Then the first thing the fractional fundraiser will do is create a fundraising plan, which hopefully includes some of those KPIs, because for every organization, it's going to be a little different, right? It really does depend on so many different factors. And we know as fundraisers, I can't like tell you, I can't prescribe advice to you. I can't be like, okay, your organization, focus on this. You're going to like that comes from doing the work of the strategy. And so the reason we start with strategy is so that early on the organization can get a handle of what to expect in terms of outputs and ultimate outcomes and how to measure those. So typically those shake out in the first couple months. But again, because every organization is so different, it's hard to sort of be specific with what they can expect.
That's fair. Can you give us an example of some of the kinds of KPIs that we might look at in the first couple months? Because I'm just also thinking about, again, putting my ED hat on.
Mhm.
Sure, Cindy, I hear you. A year, I'm willing to invest a year, and I would like some milestones in
Yeah,
between to make sure that things are moving in the right direction.
yeah. So part of it will depend on when they start. So the first thing is a fundraising plan, right? They're going to create a fundraising plan. You get to look at that and say, okay, does this feel ambitious enough? Is it realistic? I mean, again, you kind of got to trust them because they know more than you. And I would say, just for all the skeptics out there, this is someone's business. Your business is only as good as your reputation. So if a fractional fundraiser is coming in and they're like, we're not going to really raise much more this year, I would actually advise them to just not not continue the work because it's a waste of money. And that's not what they're in the business of doing. And so you are going to want to see some financial positive ROI, some growth in that by the end of that 12 months, as indicated in the fundraising plan. The other part of the fundraising plan process is engaging with stakeholders and donors, right? So you're going to see really early on that a lot of their work is meeting with people, virtually or in person, but it's getting to know and understand all the different perspectives of the organization. If someone's coming in and they're not engaging with your donors, especially if there's someone who's outside of the network that I've trained, like, big red flag. Any fundraiser who comes into an organization and doesn't actually engage with donors in the first 2 to 3 months, red flag, unless they're writing grants. But even with that, they should be connecting with grantors. So that to me would be the first, like having meetings, getting to know the supporters and internal staff, understanding programs, creating the fundraising plan. And the fundraising plan, if you're working with someone and they start in September, you're going to have a year-end campaign in there if individual giving is part of your work. If they are doing, so, if they're doing corporate, it's going to look very different. Typically, fractional fundraisers will have 2 or 3 areas of focus. But what that looks like, and their fundraising plan will have timelines. So it will say, we are going to do this campaign here, or we're going to reach out to this many corporations in a month. If they're working on corporate or grants, you should have a pipeline being developed, right? To see, okay, how many prospects do we have? All of that stuff will still happen. It's not that different to hiring in-house in terms of KPIs. It's really understanding the KPIs that are aligned with the work that they're going to be doing.
So, as I'm hearing you talk, I'd love for you to chat a little bit about the relationship between the fractional fundraiser and the executive director and the board, because
Mhm.
as we know, it can be, when it works, it's great. And when it doesn't, it can be terrible. And I think this is more broadly a question about the relationship between DODs and EDs versus not fractional fundraisers per
Yeah.
se.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts
No,
on it?
yeah. So executive directors will very easily get pulled into the same relationship they have with in-house staff because fractional fundraisers do a lot of the day-to-day work. So the dynamic can be similar. And I spent quite a bit of time coaching my network on this dynamic because this is like the thing. So, and this is why I mentioned before about trust. For some reason, executive directors have a really hard time letting go and trusting people. And it's really scary when you're investing that much money in a fundraiser to wait 12 months to trust the process. And then what happens is, because a fractional fundraiser is doing a lot of the implementation, the executive director might start delegating other stuff, right? Or like, oh, can you do this too? Or like, all that kind of stuff. And so I not constantly, but often am coaching the fractional fundraisers in my network to to really pull out of that implementation and reinforce the strategy or the reasons behind the implementation so it doesn't feel like you're just another set of hands. Because that is what happens when we work in nonprofits. If you're fundraising or anything else, right? Other duties is assigned. We laugh at that all the time. It's not funny, right? So we need to understand that and I have had, when I was doing this work as well, which I did before I trained this network, I said to clients, I know you don't want to do that, but you hired me because I'm going to push back when I think you're making the wrong decision. And that's why you hired us and not someone in-house. So we're going to do it. And it's really hard, but that dynamic is so critical to making a fractional fundraiser work in an organization and helping them be successful.
Okay, as we wind down here, I'm going to switch tacks a little bit. So if I'm listening to this and I'm a development director and I'm like, Cindy, this sounds great. I might want to be a fractional fundraiser. What might I consider before taking the leap?
Okay, I love this because I think everyone should be a fractional fundraiser. No, okay. I would say there's a lot of benefits. You get paid more money. Usually, if you're in a small, mid-size, or even sometimes like a large organization, but not in a leadership role, chances are you're going to make more money as a fractional executive. You can do the math. I'm super open about pricing and stuff like that, right? So if you have three clients, which as I said is a full-time workload, at $4,000 each month, you're making like, I think it's $144,000 a year. Not bad for being your own boss. And you only need three clients. So if you're curious about entrepreneurship, it's a really easy launch into being your own boss. I train people on the business side of things. So I will plug, if you want to be a fractional fundraiser, go to fractionalfundraising.co and there's a button, just say like, there's a wait list, or if we're open, you can apply. But yes, for so many reasons, it is great for fundraisers. A lot of the time you have control, not a lot of time, you have control over your time, your schedule. A lot of people in our network are parents with younger kids, and so they go pick up their kids at 3 o'clock every day, or what have you. Also, you get to choose. I had a conversation yesterday with one of our fractional fundraisers. She has 1.5 clients, and that's all she wants. She is a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old, and that is what she chose for herself and her family right now. She's making good money, but has all the flexibility and just enough work to keep her busy and doing things and getting paid without sacrificing the family. So I also have fractional fundraisers who have like one client and then do a bunch of other kinds of work. So I think being your own boss is fantastic.
Here, here, friend.
Yeah.
Once you taste freedom, you can never go back.
You can't go back. You cannot go back, but it's not without risk. And so some of the challenges or some of the things you have to say, okay, is this right for me? I call it the least risky way of being a consultant, but chances are going to be, you still have to do business development, which I teach you all like how, but you still got to do it. You still have to be willing to, understand that, okay, if something doesn't work out for a client, yeah, you're going to have to replace them, right? So if you have no interest in running your own business, it's probably not right for you. And yeah, just being willing to take on some risk. Again, it's not a lot, and that's also like 12-month contracts, retainer pricing. Like, it is a really smooth way to enter entrepreneurship.
Yeah. And I love that 12-month contract. thing
It's
because I think it kind of smooths out the revenue for folks.
mhm. I remember having a conversation with one of our fractional fundraisers. She was already a consultant before she joined, but she was saying she had like one December, she had her best month ever, ever, ever. Like just, pinch myself, things are so good. And January, she had zero revenue. And so I'm such a huge fan of monthly retainers. Just it makes things predictable. So I started consulting when I had like a 6-month-old and a 3-year-old. And I'm a primary, like, yeah, at the time I was a primary like earner in our family too, and I still am. So I had very low risk tolerance, but having an extended contract gave me the security that I needed to be able to take that leap.
Well, and I just want to say this to all the consultants out there who might be listening or thinking about consulting. Please do not charge an hourly. That is the
Mm,
quickest way to be poor.
yes. I do some other coaching with nonprofit consultants, and this comes up a lot. Pricing is one of those really challenging things, and hourly pricing is not your friend. It really isn't. But that is a much bigger conversation. But definitely like sometimes people are like, well, how do I know how much time to spend and all that? Like you're experienced, you're gonna figure out sort of how to manage the 3 clients, but um I definitely provide like I've tested all of this. We were doing this in-house in my business for years before I started teaching other people how to create this business model. So like in terms of how much to charge, what questions come up, how to handle the board in the discovery process, right? And understanding the multiple ways that organizations make decisions. Like all of that, we stress test over years so that it's faster for everyone who joins our network, basically.
Very cool. And is there, I know that you kind of said this already, but just to reiterate to folks, so you can expect for a fractional fundraiser to pay in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 thousand a month on retainer. Is there a threshold of budget size that you would recommend?
Not budget size. Typically, I would say for organizations that don't have a full-time fundraiser, right? Because overall organizational budgets vary significantly, and even fundraising budgets with grants can vary significantly,
Yeah.
right? I kind of
True.
mentioned there was an organization we were working with where we like quadrupled, if not more. I can't even remember how many times we grew their revenue, but it was because we were really successful with 1 or 2 really big grants. That's definitely not the norm. So the work can vary significantly, but if you're thinking about, we really do need a fundraiser, like if you're like, okay, the executive director cannot be writing appeals anymore because, you know, half the time they don't get done, and when they do get done, they're not very good. But we're raising a little bit of money. We really need to level up. That's a sweet spot.
Very cool. So where can we find you again? And I'll make sure to put it in the show notes for folks, but fractionalfundraiser.co, is that the one?
That's it. And anytime you can reach out to me if you are an organization, I will match you with a fractional fundraiser from our network, or you can find them all on our website, fractionalfundraiser.co. If you want to be a fractional fundraiser, we're opening the doors to the academy in the spring and at the end of April. So there's a wait list. Go to fractionalfundraising.co, sorry. And you will find a link to be a fractional fundraiser, and that's where the wait list is.
Fantastic. Well, Cindy, thank you so much as always, and we will talk with you soon. And I'm excited to see you in New York in January.
Yay, see you soon.